Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. Where are we at? 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. If by my numbers, let's literally give it 30 seconds, but we need to start quite promptly today. So I think the numbers are going to start climbing up a little bit, and we will much to do in the hour. So let's get straight to it. My name is, of course, Prof. Richard Cook, and delighted again to welcome you to the DFMPC and CHSE Professional Learning Series today. This is a learning workshop of the one of three types of engagement we have on this professional learning series. The other being, of course, a journal club, and the second being the Tech Tuesday. And are delighted to, of course, have our very own Jas van Us, who will take us through and present, but also particularly pleased to have our interns on the interns who is also involved in Ashad Muller's engagement, and who's doing some great work in our department as one of our interns, working on our instructional design and assisting us on the teaching and learning side to make us as faculty more efficient. So delighted to have you on this call as well for the opportunity to provide us and you, Asha. So thank you for your participation. We're looking at storyboard learning outcomes this afternoon. Our thanks for CHSE for their participation and for their partnership on this journey with us in this profession. So shall we go to it, Jas?
Yes, thanks, Richard. Thanks, everyone, and welcome to this session. So just before we start, a disclaimer. Working through storyboarding and learning outcomes normally takes a lot longer than an hour. But we are doing this in an accelerated fashion just so that you can get the idea of what storyboarding is and how easy it is to storyboard using software like Miro and so forth. So second to that is I normally use Gilly Salmon's Carpe Diem model for my own curriculum design. We also use something similar in the faculty, Richard, I just can't remember the name, which is based on Gilly Salmon, but is it Northampton University or Shira? Just to bring in the comparison, I just can't remember the name of the other framework. But basically, it's the same as the
yes. So Janis, Matty's given you the answer. They call it the Cairo system.
Cairo.
But it's also based on Gilly Salmon's model, so it's all kind of heading the same way.
So you probably have heard of Cairo. The Carpe Diem framework is basically the same thing, and so a lot of what I'm having in this session, or what we are having in this session, is drawn from that. And at the end, we will also share the workbook with you that you can use to work through. So in the previous sessions, we looked at student-centered curriculum design, curriculum mapping, and 21st century learning, as well as tech and activities that can be used for learning design. Now, all these actually fit so nicely with flowing into storyboarding, what we're doing today. So all these topics were important considerations before getting to storyboarding, as it situates the thinking about the curriculum and how we should approach it before we get to storyboarding. So thinking about how I'm going to approach my curriculum and what should be in it, what pedagogies or teaching and learning approaches am I going to draw on, what is my assessment philosophy. These are all important things to consider before we get to storyboarding. So I'm also briefly going to touch on this in another slide around deep and meaningful learning, as this is my approach and what informs my curriculum design. So in today's session, we are going to do the following. We're going to look at the starting point. I'm just going to frame it quickly, and then we're going to move on to what is storyboarding, learning outcomes, and then you're going to do an activity where you're going to create learning outcomes for a hypothetical helping you learn online course for medical sciences, and you're then going to create a storyboard for the same, and we'll just check in, have a discussion, and check out. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's a bit of thinking around your course that needs to happen before you start with storyboarding, and you need to start with the vision of your course. And you can use questions like those that are in the top left-hand corner to guide you, or draw an image of a vision about your graduate. So if you look at the second and third image is examples from the process that we as the Department of Family Medicine started last year, thinking about what our graduate should look like. We hosted this curriculum workshop to start the curriculum design, and so you can either start by sort of writing a sentence around a vision, or by having an image that shows your thinking around what your graduate should look like, and then you can work your way back. So okay, so you also have a few other considerations. One thing is thinking around multidisciplinary teams, so trying to get a team around your storyboarding or curriculum. As from my own experience, having a multidisciplinary team creates a lot of depth and richness to the course. I actually asked Stephen to speak to this, but unfortunately he wasn't able to join. But for HSS, we were quite a large team of 10 people working together on the curriculum, and we wore a lot of different hats. So as a blended learning designer, but also as a subject matter expert, and vice versa. And that we came up with some really novel and authentic ideas. So one of them, or one of my favorites, is a Twitter activity where we created a fake patient that tweets about her experience taking a baby to the hospital. So she starts by tweeting in her house in the morning, waking up in Soweto, and all the challenges that she faces to getting to the hospital and being served and so forth. And the next, so thinking about a multidisciplinary team, the next component is including students. So we talked a lot about that around student-centered curriculum design and establishing a student review committee. There's value in having the student voice as part of the review team. And then the last component is what we covered last week, is 21st century learning, where we spoke about the 21st century framework, and that we need to think about competencies that we need to include and assess, but then also how to assess that in terms of focusing on competence and confidence, and that we need to assess these in an authentic manner, so possibly longitudinal e-portfolio, so on, because exams and tests are not necessarily the best way to assess 21st century learning. So, and I want to conclude this slide by giving the vision that we developed for the MBCHB program that I was involved in, as I think it encompasses nicely what we spoke around developing a vision for a course and 21st century learning. So this was the vision that we started off with in terms of the curriculum design process. So we likened the curriculum to a DNA double helix. The arm represents, the one arm represents the theoretical and clinical components of the curriculum, while the other arm represents the graduate attributes. It's a double helix because the two need to follow each other. The base pairs of the DNA strands represent a continued longitudinal focus on the self, the patient, the community, and the healthcare system. So that was our vision to start with. So after you've established a vision, we need to think about learning outcomes, which Ashad is going to cover a little bit later. And we also need to think about assessment. Once we've done that, we get to what is storyboarding. So, or to the storyboarding phase. So storyboarding is basically the process where you visually represent the process and flow. So you map out your curriculum and the topics that flow into one another and so forth. So why is this important? It helps you to think through sequencing. It also helps with constructive alignment between the learning outcomes, the content that you want to teach, and the assessment. But it also helps you think through the notional hours, because one thing, especially in health professions education, is that we tend to overburden our students with too much content or assessment and so forth, and not keeping to the notional hours. By storyboarding, you can make sure that when a module is 10 credits, 100 notional hours, that you account for those hours within the storyboard. And I'll show you how to do that a bit later. And then the other component is that you can identify a threshold concept. So a threshold concept is a concept that you have to, that the student needs to understand in order to understand other concepts. So they cannot actually move on if they don't understand that concept. And by placing it on a storyboard, you can easily identify those concepts that might need to move around in sequence. So I also mentioned that I use deep and meaningful learning. So before you start storyboarding, you need to think about your approaches that you are going to use. You develop the learning outcomes, you think about the content and the assessment, but you also need to think about how you will engage your students. Now, Gilly Salmon refers to this as e-activities or e-tivities, and my approach to this is using deep and meaningful learning. So deep and meaningful learning is basically the end goal that you want students to achieve. So they need to make connections and personalize the learning experience. The learning needs to have meaning for them. So also just a side note that these approaches that I selected is not the only approaches that leads to deep and meaningful learning, but it's the ones that I found the easiest to approach in online and blended learning environment. And it complements one another, which I think is also very important. So let's consider these components in relation to the Twitter journey that I discussed. So if you consider case-based learning, it provides the student with a real-world context. So the students understand where that learning fits in the real world. So with the Twitter, they can identify with a patient trying to take their child to hospital and see the different challenges and what needs to be addressed. It's also authentic because it's something that they will encounter in the real world, because a company might ask them to do data analysis on a Twitter feed in terms of understanding issues. There is a self-directed component to it, because you will ask students, okay, so go and research and come up with this different solutions that you can present to improve the journey for the patient. And it's also collaborative as you engage them in online discussions, and also as a group they need to come up with the solutions, and providing feedback from the students to each other, but also from the lecturer. And then at the end, you'll have a reflection in terms of how the session helped them to understand the health issues and where they are at in terms of providing leadership and so forth. So with designing activities in mind, let's start with learning outcomes. So here I'll hand over to Ashad.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I will be covering learning outcomes, and more specifically, I'll be looking at what they are, the importance, and how to write them effectively. So let's start by looking at what exactly are learning outcomes. So learning outcomes are an essential part of any learning experience. They are specific statements of what students will be able to do when they successfully complete a session, a project, or a course. An important aspect of a learning outcome is that it should be measurable, and this is most often done through assessments. Therefore, learning outcomes not only assist with directing the content and design of a session, but they also form the basis of assessment. They can and often should also be linked to the larger amounts of learning in the form of course or discipline-specific graduate competencies. However, it should be noted that learning outcomes are not simply statements that describe the content or what the lecturer intends to do. They are also different from the aims and objectives. So let's look more closely at the differences between learning aims and objectives in order to get a better understanding of what learning outcomes are. Next slide, please. So, aims are broad and general statements of educational intent, and they should inform students of the overall purpose of the session. They are usually written from an instructor's or institution's perspective, and they give the general content and direction of the learning experience. They generally describe what an instructor or a program aims to do. For example, if you are teaching a session on the central and peripheral nervous system, then your aim could be something like, the purpose of the session is to introduce you to the central and peripheral nervous systems. Learning objectives, on the other hand, are more specific than learning aims, but less specific than learning outcomes. However, they can help you to formulate more specific learning outcomes. They are not necessarily observable or measurable, and they are instructor-centered rather than student-centered. So an example of some learning objectives that could be, we will cover the names and functions of the cranial nerves, or you will understand how the brain and spinal cord control the muscles. Learning objectives can be interpreted as what is intended. However, learning objectives can introduce unintended complexity because sometimes they are written in terms of what you intend to teach. Like the first example, which is we will cover the names and functions of the cranial nerves, and sometimes they are written in terms of what you expect the students will learn. Like the second example, which is you will understand how the brain and spinal cord control the muscles. In contrast, learning outcomes should always be written with a focus on the learner and how the learner will demonstrate achievement, which makes it easier to assess students' learning. Therefore, learning outcomes can be interpreted as what has been achieved rather than what is intended. So learning outcomes are specific statements of what students will be able to do once they have successfully completed the session. Some examples of learning outcomes, if you are teaching a topic on central and peripheral nervous systems, could be explain how the brain and spinal cord control the muscles, or describe how sensory information enters the brain. Before we look at how to write effective learning outcomes, let's look at the importance of writing effective learning outcomes. Next slide, please. So an effective learning outcome statement informs and guides both the instructor and the students. So for instructors, it can help to inform the content that you are going to teach, or the strategies you will use, the learning activities you will set, and any appropriate assessment tasks. For students, it provides them with a solid framework to guide their studies and assist them to prepare for the assessment, since they will know what they are expected to know and are able to do. However, for this to be effective, it is important for you to ensure that your learning outcomes use clear language and are understandable by the students. Now let's look at how to write effective learning outcomes. So the first step is to identify the range of cognitive skills that you want to achieve in your session. This is important because your learning outcome should align with the nature and cognitive level of understanding expected from your students. So where can we find these cognitive skills and levels? Well, Bloom's taxonomy provides a hierarchy of cognitive skills from simple recall through to the highest levels of critical thinking. Next slide, please. Okay, so on this slide, you see two images. On the left is the hierarchy of the cognitive skills taken from Bloom's taxonomy. It can be used when writing your learning outcomes, as each cognitive level provides action verbs which are needed at the start of each learning outcome. So most, if not all, of these action verbs can be measured in order to decide if they have been achieved by the student or not. The image on the right is the pedagogy wheel, and although you might not be able to see it clearly, I will put a link to access a better quality version in the chat. Anyway, the pedagogy wheel is even more useful for digital or online learning because it not only provides Bloom's cognitive domain categories and action verbs, but it also provides you with activities and apps that you can use. For example, in the create cognitive domain, some of the activities include narration, a video, a song, a podcast, or creating a cartoon. And it also gives you apps which you can use to carry those activities, such as YouTube Creator, Audio Boom, Big Collage, and Drawing Pad. So the pedagogy wheel can be a handy reference when writing your learning outcomes. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we are going to look at an easy formula you can use for writing effective learning outcomes. Sometimes learning outcomes are written in the form that say that the learner will be able to. We would advise against this, as you have no direct control over what is actually learned, and you cannot be sure that any learning at all takes place, or that learners may learn additional or unintended things. As a result, it is far better to say will be expected to be able to or should be able to. So start off by writing, by the end of the session, you should be able to, and then write each of your learning outcomes below it, starting with a measurable action verb, which you can take from Bloom's taxonomy, and adding a learning statement to it. So for example, a session on the central and peripheral nervous systems can have the following learning outcomes. So start off with, by the end of the session, you should be able to, and then write each of your learning outcomes, starting with an action verb. So outline the gross anatomy of the central and peripheral nervous systems, describe how sensory information enters the brain, explain how the brain and spinal cord control the muscles, identify the names and functions of the cranial nerves. Next slide, please. So we've already looked at the importance of 21st century skills in our previous sessions. I would now like to quickly look at writing learning outcomes for 21st century learning. It's important to ensure that your learning outcomes are focused on higher order thinking skills, which prioritize 21st century skills. These include critical thinking, problem solving. So, for example, effectively analyzing and evaluating evidence, arguments, claims, or solving different kinds of non-familiar problems in both conventional and innovative ways. Creativity is another 21st century skill where students should be able to use a wide range of idea creation techniques to create new and worthwhile ideas. Also, ICT skills where students should be able to use technology as a tool to research, organize, evaluate, and communicate information effectively. Okay, so now we will move on to a short hands-on activity where you will have a chance to write some learning outcomes. Janus will explain further. Thank you.
Okay, right. Thanks, everyone. So basically for the activity, there we go. So you form part of a task team to develop a new Helping You Learn online course for the Faculty of Health Sciences. The course is 10 credits, so 100 notional hours. It is one session per day over 7 weeks, so basically 5 hours per week. All the sessions are online self-based. We already determined the vision for the course. So after completing this course, the student will have the competence and confidence to navigate higher education learning. They will have an understanding of the learning and teaching methodologies of academic literacy, information and digital literacy, and professional and student identity. So that's basically the course. We now want you to, in groups, so I'm going to create breakaway groups, develop learning outcomes for this course. I am going to share a document in the chat, and then I'm quickly going to just show you the basic functions of Miro for you to be able to complete this activity. So in this document, you will find links to the Miro. So if, for example, your breakaway room is room 1, then you will use, you will basically be group 1, and you'll use group 1 as the, group 1 as the, as your document to work on. Okay, so let me just quickly open that. Just let me know if everyone can open the document. If not, please tell me. Okay, so I'm just going to open the main page. Okay. And so I'm just quickly going to share my screen again so that I can show you Miro. So I shared with you in the link in the advertisement the option to create a Miro account. So you can create an education account, and you can develop as many boards as you like. So if you look here at the bottom where I click there, you'll see those arrows there. If you click there, you can go to frames. So in between frames, you can hover between the storyboard and the learning outcomes. So that's where you will find the the frames where you're going to place the learning outcomes. I've placed the wheel there to assist you to develop the learning outcomes. And sorry, I also just want to show, sorry, my mouse, I'm using 2 screens and now the mouse disappeared. So here you can zoom in and zoom out. And here you can create sticky notes, that one there. So you just place your sticky notes, you can change the color. So for if you have 5 different people, you can have 5 different colors, and you just type in the sticky note, whatever, yeah, learning outcome you're writing. Okay, before I create the breakaway rooms, any questions?
Are we supposed to have downloaded this before?
No, you don't have to download it. If you click on the link for the Miro board, it will automatically take you to that. I edited it. Also made the share settings that you can edit without creating an account. Okay, then I'll quickly. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, so I'll give you 5 minutes to do this. And just delete. Oh, damn. Is there a way to quickly delete rooms? How many are there in total? Oh, that's too many. It should only be 5. Okay, so place 3. Add a room. Start rooms. Actually, sorry, realized that would probably be there. Rooms. Sorry, let me just delete and recreate all of them. Okay, so we want 5 rooms, automatically assign. Ashad, I think just one question should be fine. We need to move. It's already 20 minutes gone.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to close the rooms. Still closing.
It's all disappeared.
Yes.
Yes, that I know it's very little time to actually do something productive. Yeah, that.
I'm no longer in the group. I can't see where I am.
Yeah, we're back in the main group. Jenny.
Okay, thank
Oh.
you. So we're
Okay,
looking at the page with this group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4.
so were any of you able to design
No.
1 or 2 learning outcomes? I know, like I said, it's very quick. Okay, any feedback from or questions from the learning outcomes? Were any of you able to create one?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay. So let me just share my screen again. And okay, it's actually now sharing on the other screen. So the next component is how to storyboard. So the first part is that you start indicating the time frame for your module or course in days or weeks across the top. So if we look at the Miro board, you'll see that I created in weeks in session 1, 2, 3. If we go back to that board now, but you can do it across weeks, and you then use different color post-it notes to represent the assessment events. So, for example, as you can see, there are 3 assessment events there, which are in yellow, and you divide the content into series of discrete topics. So you will if you look at the pink post-it notes there, just it is topic 1 focuses on, topic 2 focuses on, and so forth. And then you also place your e-activities that you want to do on the storyboard. Then after that, although we're not even going to get to actually developing a full storyboard because there's just not enough time. But after you have done the storyboarding, you then use time dots. Gilly has got a specific name for this. I can't remember what she calls it, but you map out how much time students spend. I have refined it slightly in terms of they normally go with just one type of dot, 1 hour, to map out your different time constraints on the course. So after mapping out your curriculum, you then add the activities the hours to the different activities. And you also need to sort of think about your assessment in terms of how long it's going to take students. So for example, 1,000-word essay, they say just in terms of writing for a third year, this is what I found on Google. I think it takes far more time than 3.5 hours to write, but they say 1,000 hours, 1,000 words, 3.5 hours, and it takes about approximately 4 minutes to read, a 1,000-word essay. So that is the sort of things that you need to consider when you map out the activities in terms of everything that you put in. How long will it take the student to engage in online discussions or read an article, and so forth. Okay. The next step is then look at the learning outcomes which you didn't have time for and brainstorm some activities and then add them to a storyboard in terms of a sequence, how you think they should follow from one another. So if you look at the board that I created, you'll see on the side I have added some activities, and the sticky notes in teal is topics that I think might be valuable to have on in a Helping You Learn Online course. But you can add a few more, and then you need to start thinking about sequence. So if you look at this, you'll see I've mapped it out to session 1. Sorry, there you'll see session 1, it's an hour, it's online. Okay, in this case I kind of wanted to show that you can sort of map that. Let's say for example you use the flipped classroom, that you might have online online content, and then you have a face-to-face session where you might have group discussions or some problem solving case studies, whatever you want to do. That you can map out how your pre online, your face-to-face and post-online, for example, align to one another. And then you place your learning outcomes, the topics, the learning opportunities. So if you have any activities that you're going to do, and your assessment. And then you can map afterwards the hours or preparation time, which we're not going to get to. Okay, so before I create the rooms again, any questions? Okay, so then I am going to create the rooms again, and I'll give you a little bit, well, actually not a little, you also have about 5 minutes.
And especially because most of us don't be in their home.
All disappeared.
Oh,
I can't see what these things say, seriously. Ooh, no, it's too big.
Everyone's disappeared.
Yeah, sorry, you're back in the main room. Like I said, it's unfortunately a very very short introduction to storyboarding, as I mentioned, accelerated in the beginning because it's just not enough time to go through it. Yeah, so just some feedback and questions. about Miro. How did you find it? I know you had much time to explore using it. Yes, do it.
So actually, once we went back into the room the second time, we got a lot more done. I think it was nice sort of orientating ourselves the first one, but it actually seems very user-friendly. And once we got a hang of the controls, I think it would be really useful, especially when collaborating with a group of people, when you're trying to come up with a new curriculum. And it's really nice that you start with the outcomes to make sure that you don't just stick to the traditional going through the motions of your teaching instead of thinking about sort of meaningful learning opportunities that might achieve those outcomes. So we actually got going a bit on the second round, which was really cool.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I actually use Miro a lot in my own courses. So if you look at my screen here at the top, I use it for a lot of different team brainstorming. So this is the honors degree that we were busy working on and mapping it out. And so forth. It's a really handy tool to work on different things. Here's another board that we use for thinking about quality assurance in online learning. So mapping out that process in terms of how we how you do instructional design. Yeah. So the one thing I just saw that Shira posted, so I think that's also a valuable, I've never seen this before, so thanks Shira, a course workload estimator by Rice University that can help you work out your activities and so forth. Any other feedback? Just see what the chat say. Yeah, so there's definitely alignment between loop and storyboarding. So I think loop is it's sort of another way of mapping out and sequencing your curriculum, because the whole idea with loop is to see where what is covered, so forth. But it's a bit more of a technical process. Shira, I don't know if you wanted to add something.
Sorry, just had to get back to my microphone. You mean in relation to loop or just the developing outcomes in general?
In relation to loop or in terms of storyboarding session? So
I think that one of the constraints of loop is that it does fixate on Bloom's taxonomy. And I do encourage people to look at other taxonomies when they're developing outcomes, because you don't want to have the same verbs all the time that students now know what it is that they have to do. But you should also develop a glossary for the verbs, so that if you say discuss, a student will have to know that they need both sides of an argument, for example, and not just be able to parrot fashion give you a description of something. So your class needs to know what you expect when you start using verbs like that. And I did note earlier that verbs like to have an understanding of, or to know, or to learn about are not things that are specifically measurable. So people don't really like those as part of the objectives. I was just having a look now to see there is an extended version of Bloom's taxonomy, which I sometimes like to use, which will help you with your 21st century learning outcomes. And I'll just find a link for it now, because it works on not only the knowledge domain, which is the cognitive domain, really, but it also looks at affective, and to some extent, it can even look at psychomotor. Although we tend to, and I mean, Stuart will probably bear this out, we tend to look at Miller's pyramid in terms of psychomotor skills. But I do think that it's useful to be able to see how people could stratify the learning and classify it a little bit more carefully with regard to the different domains, not just the cognitive domain. I'm looking carefully, so while I look, you can carry on your chat, Yanis.
So while I was looking through my screens, I was also looking for a app that was developed by, I think it's University of Northampton. Ashad, I shared the link with you yesterday. It was with the Pebble project. That has a whole list of different verbs with nice classifications to unpack that, and I thought that was also quite a useful tool to use. Right, so I think are there any other questions or comments? So then I just have one last slide. And that is, what do you think is the value of storyboarding for you? And how will you use this going forward? And just as a checkout activity in the chat, post just 2 or 3 sentences thinking about how this sparked anything or not in terms of the way forward. And then, yeah, thanks everyone for joining. And I'll also place.
Sorry, Yanis, my internet is so slow. I have found the infographic and I'll just post it in the chat so people can pick it up afterwards.
I'm also just quickly looking for the Gilly Salmon thing that I said I'll share. And then
Yes, thanks very much.
thanks, Richard. And thanks everyone else. Hope you have a lovely afternoon.
And thanks to Ashad as well for his contribution. Really nice to hear him giving inputs and taking us through a very, very well articulated part of his presentation. Ashad, thank you.